I never believed in urban legends. Growing up in a suburban town, tales of haunted houses and supernatural creatures were just that, tales. But everything changed the summer my best friend Jamie disappeared. It all started innocently enough with a late-night campfire in the woods behind our neighborhood. We were a group of bored teenagers seeking a thrill, unaware that we were about to stumble into a nightmare. The woods had always been our playground, a place where we could escape the mundane routines of school and family life. But that night, the forest felt different, darker, more oppressive. The air was thick with a silence that seemed to swallow our laughter and the crackling of the fire. It was Jamie who first mentioned the Slender Man, a figure he'd read about online. We scoffed at his story, but as he described the tall, faceless man in the black suit, an uneasy feeling settled over us. Jamie had always been the skeptic, the one who laughed at ghost stories and mocked horror movies. Yet, as he spoke of the Slender Man, there was a tremor in his voice that made my skin crawl. He claimed the Slender Man stalked children, leading them into the woods where they were never seen again. It was supposed to be just another story, a way to scare us before bed. But Jamie's obsession with the legend grew, and soon, it wasn't just a story anymore. A few days after the campfire, Jamie started acting strange. He became distant, spending hours alone in his room poring over forums and websites dedicated to the Slender Man. He spoke less, his once lively eyes now hollow and haunted. I tried to reach out to him, but he brushed me off, insisting he was fine. It wasn't until I saw the drawings that I realized how deep his obsession had become. His bedroom walls were covered in sketches of the Slender Man, tall, thin, and faceless, with tentacle-like appendages extending from his back. The drawings were disturbingly detailed, each one more sinister than the last. Jamie claimed he saw the Slender Man in his dreams, watching him from the shadows. He spoke of whispers that filled his mind, urging him to venture deeper into the forest. I was terrified for him, but he was convinced the Slender Man was real and that he had to find him. One night, I followed Jamie into the woods. He moved with purpose, as if guided by an unseen force. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. It was then that I saw it, a shadowy figure standing among the trees, impossibly tall and eerily still. My breath caught in my throat as I realized it was the Slender Man. Jamie walked towards the figure, his steps slow and deliberate. I wanted to scream, to pull him back, but my voice was paralyzed by fear. The Slender Man extended a long, slender arm, and Jamie reached out to take it. In that moment, the shadows seemed to swallow them both, and I was left standing alone in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally found the courage to move, Jamie was gone. I searched the woods for hours, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. But there was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. The police conducted a search, but they found nothing. Jamie had vanished without a trace, just like the stories said. The Slender Man had taken him. In the days that followed Jamie's disappearance, the town was gripped by a palpable tension. Search parties combed the woods, while parents kept their children close, fearful of the unknown predator lurking in the shadows. Despite the police's best efforts, there was no trace of Jamie, no footprints, no torn clothing, nothing. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. I couldn't shake the image of the Slender Man from my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that faceless figure standing silently among the trees. My nights were plagued by nightmares, and I found myself avoiding the woods altogether. But it wasn't just fear that kept me away. It was the feeling of being watched, a sensation that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. Jamie's parents were devastated. Their house, once filled with laughter and the sounds of everyday life, now felt like a mausoleum. I visited them often, hoping to offer some comfort, but my presence only seemed to remind them of their loss. The police questioned me repeatedly, and though I told them everything I knew, they looked at me with a mixture of suspicion and pity. They didn't believe in the Slender Man, and who could blame them? It was a story from the internet, a modern myth. But then the whispers started. I would hear them at night, soft and insistent, calling my name from the darkness outside my window. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a manifestation of my guilt and fear. But the whispers grew louder, more persistent, filling my head with thoughts that weren't my own. They told me to go back to the woods, to follow in Jamie's footsteps. Desperate for answers, I turned to the same forums and websites that had consumed Jamie. I read countless accounts of encounters with the Slender Man, each one more terrifying than the last. People described seeing him in their dreams, feeling his presence in their homes, and being driven to madness by his whispers. The stories varied, but the underlying theme was the same. Once the Slender Man had chosen you, there was no escape. I started to notice strange occurrences around town. Children spoke of seeing a tall man watching them from the edge of the forest. Pets went missing, their collars found in places they couldn't have reached on their own. And then there were the symbols, crude, stick-like figures drawn in the dirt, etched into tree bark, and even scratched onto the sides of houses. They were signs, I realized, warnings of the Slender Man's presence. Despite my fear, I knew I had to find out what happened to Jamie. I couldn't let his disappearance be another unsolved mystery, another tale to frighten children. One night, armed with a flashlight and a notebook, I ventured into the woods alone. The air was thick with the scent of pine and decay, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and my own footsteps. Every shadow seemed to move, every tree a potential hiding place for the Slender Man. I followed a trail of symbols, each one leading me deeper into the forest. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow and quick. I was terrified, but I couldn't turn back. Not now. As I walked, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, urging me forward. They spoke of Jamie, of his fate, and of the secrets hidden in the heart of the woods. After what felt like hours, I came to a clearing. In the center stood an old, abandoned cabin, its walls covered in the same crude symbols. The whispers were deafening now, a chorus of voices that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath my feet. I knew I had to go inside. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door and stepped into the darkness. The air inside the cabin was stale, filled with the scent of rot and mildew. My flashlight cast long, flickering shadows across the walls, illuminating the crude drawings of the Slender Man. Each step I took seemed to echo, a stark reminder of my isolation. The whispers that had guided me here now felt oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I called out for Jamie, but my voice sounded small and hollow in the darkness. There was no response, just the steady drip of water from somewhere deep within the cabin. I moved deeper, my flashlight revealing fragments of shattered furniture and torn wallpaper. This place had been abandoned for years, yet the symbols were fresh, as if someone, or something, had been here recently. I approached the chest, my heart pounding. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very walls. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid and shone my flashlight inside. The sight that greeted me was worse than any nightmare. Inside the chest were the remains of small animals, their bodies twisted and broken. Scattered among them were children's toys, each one marked with the same crude symbol of the Slender Man. At the back of the cabin, I found a staircase leading down into a basement. The door at the top was ajar, as if inviting me to descend. I hesitated, my fear battling with my need for answers. The whispers grew louder, urging me forward. Steeling myself, I began the descent, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was colder, the air thick with an almost tangible darkness. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. In the center of the room stood an old wooden table, covered in a thick layer of dust. On it lay a collection of old photographs, each one showing the same tall, faceless figure standing among the trees. I picked one up, my hands shaking. In the background, I recognized the forest behind our neighborhood. A sudden movement in the corner of my eye made me turn sharply. There, at the far end of the basement, stood Jamie. His eyes were wide and vacant, his face pale and gaunt. He looked like he hadn't eaten or slept in days. Relief and horror washed over me simultaneously. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Instead, he pointed to a dark corner of the basement, where a large wooden chest sat partially open. I approached the chest, my heart pounding. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from the very walls. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid and shone my flashlight inside. The sight that greeted me was worse than any nightmare. Inside the chest were the remains of small animals, their bodies twisted and broken. Scattered among them were children's toys, each one marked with the same crude symbol of the Slender Man. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Jamie still stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the chest. It was then that I realized the truth. Jamie had become one of them, a pawn in the Slender Man's game. The whispers had driven him to madness, compelling him to collect these macabre trophies. I had to get him out of here, away from this place. Grabbing his arm, I tried to lead him towards the stairs, but he resisted, his eyes wild with fear. "We have to go, Jamie," I pleaded, but he shook his head violently. "He won't let us," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "He's always watching." Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, plunging us into darkness. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving us in pitch black. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for the stairs, dragging Jamie with me. But the whispers had turned to screams, filling the air with a cacophony of terror. I could feel a presence behind me, cold and malevolent, drawing closer with each passing second. Just as I reached the stairs, I felt a cold, slender hand wrap around my wrist. I screamed, pulling Jamie with all my strength. Somehow we made it up the stairs and burst through the door, back into the cabin. The whispers faded as we ran, not stopping until we were out of the woods and back in the safety of the streetlights. I looked at Jamie, his eyes wide with terror. He was free, but the cost had been high. The Slender Man had left his mark on both of us, and I knew he would never truly be gone. The legend was real, and we were living proof. Jamie's return should have been a cause for celebration, but the town received him with fear and suspicion. His parents were overjoyed to have him back, but it didn't take long for them to realize that the Jamie who had returned was not the same boy who had disappeared. He was quieter, his eyes hollow and distant, as if haunted by what he had seen. He spoke little, and when he did, it was often in whispers, as if afraid of being overheard. The whispers followed him home, a constant, insidious presence that gnawed at his sanity. I tried to help him, to bring him back to the friend I once knew, but he was slipping further away. He refused to speak of the Slender Man, but his eyes told the story, a tale of endless night and unrelenting terror. One evening, as we sat in his room, Jamie confided in me. "He's still with me," he said, his voice barely audible. "He never leaves. Even now he's watching." He gestured to the window, where the shadows seemed to deepen, taking on a life of their own. I glanced outside, my heart pounding, but saw nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched was unmistakable. Jamie showed me a notebook he had kept hidden under his bed. It was filled with frantic scribbles and drawings, each one more disturbing than the last. Pages upon pages of the Slender Man, sometimes depicted with tentacle-like appendages, other times as a mere silhouette lurking in the background. The most chilling drawings were of children, their faces contorted in fear, reaching out as if pleading for help. "He's in my head," Jamie whispered, clutching the notebook to his chest. "I can't escape him. He makes me see things, hear things. I don't know what's real anymore." His confession filled me with dread. Jamie was slipping further into madness, and I felt helpless to stop it. As the days passed, the occurrences around town grew stranger. More children reported seeing the Slender Man, and the symbols began appearing in unexpected places, on school walls, playground equipment, and even in the bathrooms. It was as if the legend was seeping into our reality, becoming more than just a story. The town was on edge, parents keeping their children indoors, fearful of what lurked in the shadows. One night, Jamie disappeared again. This time, there was no trace, no whispered warnings. He was simply gone. Desperation drove me back to the forest, back to the cabin where it had all started. I had to find him, to save him from whatever nightmare had claimed him. Armed with a flashlight and Jamie's notebook, I ventured into the woods alone. The forest was even more oppressive this time, the trees seeming to close in around me. The symbols were everywhere, guiding me deeper into the darkness. The whispers returned, filling my mind with half-formed thoughts and fears. I followed them, knowing they would lead me to Jamie. At the clearing, the cabin loomed like a specter, its windows dark and empty. The door creaked open as I approached, and I stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of decay. The basement door was already open, a dark void waiting to swallow me whole. With a deep breath, I descended the stairs once more. The basement was colder than before, the shadows deeper. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light that barely pierced the darkness. In the center of the room, Jamie stood, his back to me, staring at the chest. I called his name, but he didn't respond. As I approached, the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their unearthly chorus. Jamie turned slowly, his eyes vacant and lifeless. "He wants you too," he whispered. "He needs us both." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The Slender Man had been using Jamie to lure me back, to bring me into his grasp. The shadows around us seemed to move, coalescing into the tall, faceless figure that had haunted my nightmares. The Slender Man reached out, his slender fingers brushing against my skin. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't move. His touch was cold, draining the warmth and life from my body. Just as I felt myself slipping away, Jamie stepped between us. "No," he said, his voice stronger than I had ever heard it. "You can't have him." The Slender Man recoiled, his form flickering like a bad signal. With a final, desperate effort, Jamie shoved me towards the stairs. "Run!" he screamed. I didn't need to be told twice. I ran up the stairs, the whispers turning to screams behind me. As I burst through the cabin door and into the night, I glanced back to see Jamie standing at the top of the stairs, his eyes locked on mine. The door slammed shut, and I knew I would never see him again. The aftermath of that night left me shattered. Jamie was gone, lost to the darkness of the forest and the malevolent entity that dwelled within. I returned home, but the shadows followed me, a constant reminder of the horror I had witnessed. The whispers, once a soft murmur at the edge of my consciousness, grew louder, more insistent. I knew the Slender Man was still watching, still waiting. Days turned into weeks, and the town began to recover, or at least pretend to. Parents clung tighter to their children, warning them of the dangers lurking in the woods. The symbols continued to appear, a haunting reminder of the legend that had become all too real. But the police had given up the search for Jamie, and his disappearance became just another sad chapter in the town's history. I couldn't let it end there. Jamie had sacrificed himself to save me, and I owed it to him to find a way to stop the Slender Man. I delved deeper into the lore, seeking out those who had encountered the entity and survived. Late-night conversations with strangers on obscure forums, phone calls to people who claimed to have banished similar beings, and hours spent deciphering ancient texts led me to one conclusion. The Slender Man thrived on fear and belief. Armed with this knowledge, I began to formulate a plan. It was risky, and the likelihood of success was slim, but it was the only way I could see to put an end to the terror. I needed to confront the Slender Man on my terms, to strip away his power by facing my fear head-on. I gathered what I needed: a mirror, a lantern, and a journal filled with protective symbols and incantations. On a moonless night, I returned to the forest. The air was heavy with anticipation, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves. I walked the familiar path, each step bringing me closer to the clearing and the cabin that had become the epicenter of my nightmares. The symbols guided me, glowing faintly in the darkness, their presence both a warning and a reassurance. When I reached the clearing, I set up my makeshift altar. The mirror was positioned to reflect the forest behind me, the lantern casting a warm, steady light. I opened the journal, the pages filled with drawings and notes, each one a testament to the countless hours spent preparing for this moment. I took a deep breath and began to recite the incantations, my voice steady despite the fear gnawing at my gut. At first, nothing happened. The forest remained silent, the shadows undisturbed. But as I continued to speak, the air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more urgent. I kept my eyes on the mirror, watching for any sign of movement. The shadows shifted, and I saw him, the Slender Man, emerging from the darkness like a living nightmare. He moved closer, his faceless visage reflecting in the mirror. I could feel his presence, a cold, oppressive weight that pressed down on my chest. My voice wavered, but I forced myself to continue, reciting the incantations with renewed fervor. The Slender Man paused, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. I could sense his confusion, his power waning as I faced him without fear. In the mirror, I saw Jamie. He stood behind the Slender Man, his eyes filled with a determination that mirrored my own. He nodded, a silent encouragement that filled me with a newfound strength. I raised the journal, its pages glowing with an otherworldly light, and spoke the final words of the incantation. The Slender Man writhed, his form distorting and collapsing in on itself. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of rage and pain. But I held my ground, my eyes locked on the mirror. Jamie reached out, his hand passing through the Slender Man and touching mine. There was a blinding flash of light, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, the Slender Man was gone. The forest was still. The oppressive darkness lifted. Jamie was nowhere to be seen, but I felt his presence, a comforting warmth that filled the clearing. I knew he had found peace, freed from the entity that had haunted him. I returned home, exhausted but triumphant. The whispers were gone, the shadows no longer menacing. The symbols in the town faded over time, their power broken. The Slender Man was a legend once more, a story to be told around campfires and forgotten in the light of day. But I would never forget. Jamie had given his life to save me, and I had repaid that debt by freeing him. The Slender Man was gone, but the lesson remained. Some legends are real, and the greatest weapon against them is the courage to face the darkness within. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more chilling tales, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Your support helps me create more content for you. Thanks for watching, and stay spooky.